The Amiga was, is, and always will be better than the PC. There, I said it, and I'll say it again if I have to. You know, it doesn't even matter to me that the Amiga has basically been dead for over 15 years now. All that PC gaming takes up 99% of my gaming time nowadays. The Amiga still takes the prize. Why? Well, because when the Amiga was on the scene, computers were mysterious. They weren't everyday items like they are now. The Windows 3.1 PCs I used at my schools also had a certain magic about them, and I recall plenty of special days when my class was allowed to gather round the school's one good system, play Day of the Tentacle and coo at all the funky graphics and things you could do. But we didn't have a PC in the home, we had an Amiga. They were, after all, a hell of a lot cheaper than PCs, a couple of £100 as opposed to over £1,000. They were dubbed family computers for a reason. The parents typed up their documents, and then they gave the computer to their kids who'll play their games, ones that were entirely different to the console games of the time. I mean, sure, there were plenty of great arcadey titles around, and a lot of them came out on the consoles as well, but then there were the other things. The Mega Drive or SNES weren't ever going to do games like Civilization or Theme Park. There wouldn't be anything like Syndicate or even football management games. I mean, the consoles did try to do these games, but a lot of the time they were, well, utter crap. The Amiga was the primo games computer over here in Europe until the arrival of the game that changed everything. With Doom, the PC suddenly burst out of its brown suit business image and showed off its muscles. And worst of all, it showed things that you just couldn't and wouldn't ever be able to do on an Amiga. And the rest is, as they say, history. The fans stayed loyal but gradually got smaller in number as the machine faded away. By the middle of '96, the Amiga was on the scrap heap, with barely any releases left to come. Everyone was saying goodbye and reading the last rites, including the greatest magazine ever made. However, despite the bleakness of the situation and my undying love for Doom in all of its forms, I still stuck with my Amiga until the very bitter end. It honestly took me until about 1999 to realise that there was just nothing left. If my Amiga wasn't ever going to get Doom, it seemed pretty obvious that the likes of Half-Life and Quake 3 Arena wouldn't be coming out either. And so it was finally time to move on. But abandoning the Amiga completely and never touching the system or the games again was utterly out of the question. Same with the PS1 and the Mega Drive. And so that's why I am what I am, making videos, blabbering about old games on YouTube, and playing them just as much, if not more, than I play brand spanking new ones. I could never leave behind those great experiences I had with the system. You know, they were experiences that got me thinking about how I could be playing games for the rest of my life. And really, thanks to those experiences, I have to confess that my mental image of a computer is still a big white keyboard that takes 3.5-inch floppy disks. Now, it is possible that this introduction might just seem a trifle overblown for what is, simply put, a soccer game. But this isn't any old soccer game, it's sensible soccer. Many Amiga games were cherished by the system's fans, but really none more so than this one. Sensible Soccer was the dominant title on the computer from its original release in 1992 until the system's demise, both commercially and critically. It was to Amiga fans what Doom was to PC fans, the killer title, the essential release, the one you had to have if you wanted to consider yourself a fan. Like Doom, it was also ported to consoles, and as simple as the game was, those ports still couldn't touch the original. and the big football games on the consoles, you know, the FIFAs and the like, frankly felt like they'd gone backwards when compared to Sensi. They may have looked nice, but they were slower, clunkier, more complicated. Football games ended up drifting in that direction, and nowadays they're truly something else. FIFA provides the most detailed, intricate and realistic simulation of football that there has ever been, and make no mistake, it's a pretty stunning achievement. And yet it's still missing that feel that Sensible Soccer had. It's not simply magic, it's an entirely different type of game, a game that was influential way beyond the sports genre. Influential enough that the '94 version of the game, Sensible World of Soccer, was classed by Stanford University as one of the 10 most important video games of all time. This mere sports game shares list space with Doom, Mario, Civilization, Tetris, and frickin' Space War. But to examine the hows and whys of the game, and what makes it so different, so special and influential, we have to go right back to the games that shaped Sensi. 4 games, above all else, made Sensi what it was. And that's what this first video in this series is all about. Rest assured, there's plenty more to come. Let us begin. Game 1, Tehkan World Cup. This is where it all started. A Japanese arcade title from 1985, released by the guys who'd eventually become Tecmo. Tehkan World Cup was a big leap forward for football games in general. There wasn't anything out there that could match the game's speed or flow, and even now it still plays a pretty slick game of football, especially when you look at the game's contemporaries. Tehkan had a pretty unique control system. First off, it used a trackball for player control, the player moving faster depending on how hard you spun the ball. Secondly, the game used one button only, simply called kick. Depending on how long you press the button down for and how you manoeuvre the trackball along with it, you could pull off a variety of different passes, shots and balls. If you'd like a comprehensive list, then you may want to go to Wikipedia's surprisingly excellent and immaculate entry for the game. It's not easy to properly experience this game in MAME, because the cabinet was a big part of the action. The game was released in cocktail form, with the player or players positioned face to face looking down on the action. You can almost think of it as a virtual emulation of football in that sense, and the action's just as fast. The turnaround from defending in one end and scoring in the opposing end can take as little as 5 seconds. However, there's still a fair bit to appreciate about this game, even almost 30 years after its release. Video gaming pretty much started out with people trying to emulate the complexities of sports, and it's always been a big part of the technical achievements in gaming over the year. One look at the sports games released in a certain year can tell us a lot about where video games were at the time. And it's clear from this game that in 1985 we made a big leap forward. And as soon as Tehkan World Cup was released, the race to get that game in the home was on. And this is where Sensible Software originally came in. Game 2, Micro Pro Soccer. By the time they released Micro Pro Soccer in 1988, Sensible Software had already started to make a few waves. In the previous year, they'd released one of the C64's best remembered titles, the unique and frenetic Whizball. They received rave reviews all over the shop for that game, not to mention selling a fair bit, just as many coders of the time had done. Making a football game was the next major step for these young up-and-comers, and the Sensi team, headed by John Hare and Chris Yates, looked to Tehkan World Cup for inspiration. Now I should say at this point that I was a Spectrum kid growing up, and that the most remembered football titles on that system are probably slow power bar game Matchday 2 and randomised results simulator Football Manager. Oh, and possibly Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona, a rubbish game, but probably the only footy game where you exclusively play as the goalie. Looking at the C64's Micro Pro Soccer for the first time in 2012, I must confess that I am retrospectively green with envy. Take one last look at Matchday 2, and then look at this. Microprose Soccer was the closest anyone had got to Tehkan. Not only did it share the same viewpoint, but it's got the same fluidity to boot, even if it is a trifle slower. Plus it's got the one button action. As usual, the button determines how hard you kick the ball depending on how long you hold it down, although it also does tackles, something that Tehkan World Cup did automatically depending on your player's position. Another big feature of this game is something that was just a bug in Tehkan: Aftertouch. Sensei Software made Aftertouch a big part of the game. Hold right or left while shooting, and the player can curl the ball like a banana, hopefully fooling the keeper or scoring otherwise magnificent goals. There are a couple of changes too. Some might say that Tehkan had their control system a bit backwards in places. Tapping the kick button usually resulted in a massive clearance all the way to the other end of the pitch. Here, tapping the button simply knocks the ball in front of you, and you can even use it to beat your man. And that's the sort of system we use to get in today. These improvements may well actually make this game more playable than Tehkan today, especially considering that you don't need any kind of trackball for this one. Microprose Soccer has plenty of other tricks up its sleeve aside from Aftertouch, including some really fine little details. Perhaps the coolest of these is the replays that actually emulate a tape being rewound. I wonder how they managed to pull that off so seamlessly, and I'm immediately envious once more. The game also has weather effects, manual goalies, name entry, and indoor six-a-side football, as well as the traditional outdoor 11. The funny thing about this game really was that I approached it thinking it was perhaps going to be a historical curio that hadn't held up at all today, but in which you could see some of the building blocks for sensible soccer. But it's actually held up astonishingly well. Very few 8-bit soccer games are fun to play today, but this is absolutely one of them. I thoroughly recommend it. And are those building blocks there? Absolutely. Sensible Software were already putting their own personality and spin on their games while still providing the goods gameplay-wise, and you can see that even with this, their first football title, they already had a really good thing going. However, Microprose Soccer was not the best known football game of the era. Just about everyone's eyes were looking at another series of games on the Amiga. Enter a Dutch programmer by the name of Dino Dini. Dino Dini's hugely important part in the history of football games may not have been a role he would have picked for himself at the start of his career. When software house Anco asked him to program a footy game for the A500, he admittedly wasn't much of a football fan. But the game he came up with, Kick-Off, was greeted like manna from heaven by sporty Amiga users who were pretty starved for any sort of decent football game whatsoever. In 1989, there really wasn't all that many decent footy games around, and what was there was more like Matchday, slow and really quite cumbersome by this point. Kick-Off was decidedly not slow, it was fast. Very fast. You can see that this game was influenced by the ones we've previously covered. It takes Microprose Soccer's camera, and it's as fast as Tehkan World Cup, if not more so. However, that's where the comparisons end. Not only does Kick-Off play entirely differently to both of those games, it had a much larger scope too. The pitch is so much bigger than the tiny fields of those previous games, it feels like a scaled model of an actual pitch. That and the time's been increased too, with 5-minute halves now being the minimum. You could fit 3 games of Tehkan into that amount of time. But the big change is in the controls. Kick-Off wasn't just another arcade game, it was an attempt at a simulation. In Tehkan and Microprose Soccer, the ball is basically glued to your feet. You'll only lose it if you're tackled or if you kick the ball. Dino Dini's big idea was to actually emulate the need for ball control. You can't just run around in all directions with the ball. In fact, unless you're very good at the game, switching directions with the ball at all will usually result in you losing it. It's very tough to do any sort of dribbling whatsoever. Passing the ball is what's important. You have to learn how to successfully trap the ball by holding the button down, and then try to pass it fluidly amongst your teammates until you get it in the goal. Tackling is tough too, seeing as this game actually has fouls and cards. The previous two games didn't have them. Occasionally games would have them, but a lot of the time they weren't programmed in. Kickoff helped codify the genre. After this game, any serious football game would have ball control, fouls, scaled pitches and so on as standard. One game had to do it first, and this was the one. It can be said that Kickoff is much too slanted in favour of passing, that dribbling should have been a bit more forgiving. But it was the first game to try out these things, for which it deserves credit, even if as a result of that it really hasn't held up when compared to other simulations of football, like our feature game for example. At the time it showed what was possible, and although it was largely devoid of options and pretty miserable in single player mode, for people with friends it was a godsend, one of the best multiplayer games you could get. The series solidified its place at the top of the Amiga football tree with the sequel, imaginatively titled Kickoff 2, in 1990, and it was unquestionably top of the tree until the release of Sensi in 92, but we'll get to that later. In the meantime, just what were the Sensible boys up to in the long space between Microprose and Sensi?
Game 4 Megalomania.
It may be an odd switch to move from the football games we've been covering to this, but all will be revealed soon enough. Megalomania was released by Sensible Software in 1991 for the Amiga. Their first major release on the system, it was well received and ported just about everywhere, including onto the 16-bit consoles. If you're a Yank and you played this game on the Genesis, then chances are you knew it as Tyrants Fight Through Time. It's a real-time strategy game in which you control one of 4 gods, and you're tasked with the objective of destroying the other 3 in order to conquer a new planet. The game is divided into 9 epochs, ranging from the Neolithic to the Information Age, with everything in between. You start with rocks and sticks, and technology advances from there, going through pikes, catapults, swords, biplanes, nuclear missiles, and eventually ending with flying saucers and laser turrets. If you're good, you'll advance well beyond your rivals and crush them beneath the wheels of progress. It's a concept that'll be familiar to anyone aware of civilization. Still, although Megalomania is a perfectly fine game, a solid fast-paced RTS that can easily be recommended to anyone, we're not really here to discuss the merits of it. Instead, perhaps you'd like to take a look at these men. Do they in any way look familiar? Indeed. The story is as follows. While spending hours poring over the code for Megalomania, the Sensible team spent a lot of their free time playing the hottest football game on the Amiga, which was, of course, Kickoff 2. They played it a hell of a lot, enough to break the game down entirely into things they liked and things that they didn't like. All of a sudden, even while Megalomania was still being developed, the ideas for Sensible Software's next game were forming, a return to football. Lead programmer Chris Chapman quickly knocked up a pitch, using the same overhead view we've seen plenty of times now, only with the camera zoomed out just a little bit, much the same as in this game actually, and they started to experiment, using the soldiers from Megalomania as sprites and dressing them up in football kits. After Megalomania wrapped up, work began on the football game in earnest, and a year or so later, with a megaton of hype at its back, Sensible Soccer was released in the summer of 1992. So, what happened next? Well, you'll just have to wait until the next video to find out. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this look back at the 4 main games that, in one form or another, shaped Sensible Soccer. From the classic influences, to the big rivals, right down to the previous project. In part 2, we'll finally get to the big game itself, Sensible Soccer, a game that took the ball from its rivals and ran it straight into the sun.
You're a gold-starring superstar hero. You let your head down and play to the fans. You're a gold-starring superstar hero. And every goal, that you're the best in the land.
Well, we've already had the 20-minute introduction, so now we can move on to talking about the game itself. The one, the only, Sensible Soccer, which hit the shelves in the summer of 1992. Now, how was it received? The weakest score it got was a somewhat unenthusiastic 78% from Amiga Action, which deemed the game close to Kickoff 2, but certainly not a KO2 beta. This review went quite against the grain, considering the other scores from major Amiga Macs. Amiga Power, 93, The One, 93, CU Amiga, 91, Amiga Format, 91. The list goes on, an endless stream of very high marks, and I'm not even looking at the slew of 90s it got from multi-platform Macs. The game wasn't what you would call a slow burner. It crashed into the top of the Amiga charts as soon as it came out, and stayed there just about forever. Now you may ask where the previous kin of football games on the system was during all of this. Well, Kickoff mastermind Dino Dealey, having also left his mark on footy management by creating Player Manager with the engine, a series much too big to be covered properly here, eventually split with Anco and ended up making one more footy game on the system called Goal, or to be more accurate, Goal! in 1993. Despite the new title, clever advertising meant that the people knew exactly what they were getting, and the game was a commercial hit and critical success, although not on the level of Sensi. Anco still released Kickoff games without Dealey at the helm, and they were utterly atrocious. The final Amiga game, Kickoff 96, famously receiving all of a single percentage point in the final issue of Amiga Power. And all the while, Sensi went from strength to strength, releasing updates to the Amiga original, overseeing ports for just about every machine going, and occasionally throwing out the odd bit of fun for magazine cover discs. And you can be damn sure that we'll be covering as much of this stuff as we possibly can. Perhaps though it's best to pull back and delve into how the game plays in general, for anyone who's not so aware. Sensible Soccer was designed with simplicity in mind. Like the football games in the previous video, it only uses a single button. Quite handy considering that's all you usually had with Amiga controllers. The button kicks the ball when you've got it, and it triggers a slide tackle when you don't, exactly like their previous game, Micropro Soccer. Tapping the button passes the ball along the ground to the nearest player, and holding it plays a longer ball. The big thing you have to learn, however, is the aftertouch, which has changed dramatically. You have full control over the ball's flight after a kick with the stick. Pulling it back and forward controls the height, and left and right controls the curl. Micropro Soccer had aftertouch, of course, but it was a canned motion that never varied, whereas here you can put on as much or as little aftertouch as you require, within reason. It's not a totally ridiculous banana curve, it's an exaggerated natural motion that you would expect a ball to make in real life, depending on how you hit it. Then there's the matter of ball control. Kickoff was the first game to introduce this idea, but it was hard to do anything with the ball there except run with it in a straight line. Any sort of direction change would probably result in the ball being lost. Sensi finds a happy medium between this and the glue effect that we found in Micropro Soccer. You can still lose the ball, but it's somewhat more forgiving and easier to learn. With practice you can definitely do some proper dribbling. The main improvements that Sensi made over games like Kickoff, however, were in things that you didn't really see, such as the zoomed out camera. The zoomed out camera wasn't just to differentiate the game from Kickoff, it was done so the game wouldn't need Kickoff's radar, allowing players to keep their eyes entirely on the action, thus giving the game better flow. The other thing you don't see, compared to the other games, is the smoothness of its switches, especially off the ball. The game switches effortlessly between the players you control when you're in defence, and the next player you're passing to on an attack. It doesn't make any mistakes, and it'll even switch between passing to a player's feet and performing a through pass in front of them, depending on where they are and what you're playing. The game performs these tasks seamlessly. I never find myself thinking, why did you pass the ball there after a failed sortie on goal? This is the area where Sensi truly innovated, and it gives the game the fluidity it needs. The standard this game set in pass selection and automatic switching is still the ideal for football games today. So that's a general summary of how Sensible Soccer plays. You can almost think of it as the perfect tabletop football game. Perfectly scaled down and full of action that absolutely anyone can follow and pick up in a heartbeat. Sensi has all the natural playability of arguably its greatest true influence, one that I didn't mention before, Subbuteo. We can now take this general summary and string it into the many different versions of the original game that exist, starting with the very first, Sensible Soccer version 1.0. All of what I've just mentioned is there, including some incredible crowd atmosphere. Again, something that a lot of football games had previously missed out on, usually only including crowd noise whenever something happens. In Sensi there's a constant crowd buzz, and not only will they react to events on the pitch, they'll chant and wave as the ball gets played around, just as a normal crowd does, getting wilder as the match gets more exciting. And of course there are all the teams. A big collection of club and national teams from Europe make up most of them, alongside a large bunch of Sensible Software's signature silly custom teams. Who can pass up the opportunity to play as Bad Words United, CJ Starbirds, or the Sensible 11? And not only is there a bunch of preset league and cup competitions, but you can make your own as well. You don't need a pen and paper anymore. And you can have as many players as you want. Theoretically, if you had enough people, you could make a 20-team league and every team could be human-controlled. Football games just didn't have this sort of depth before Sensi. The Amiga Power Review wasn't kidding when they said that this game could be your life, and I tell you right now that you have not seen nothing yet. And as far as human-controlled goes, I barely need to tell you how good this game is with 2 players. It's pretty damn magical. However, while Sensi strolled to the top of the tree as soon as it came out and was celebrated by all, its launch wasn't quite perfect. Amiga Action was a pretty awful magazine, responsible for giving scores of 92% to Rise of the Robots, and amazingly 73% to the hilariously broken Kickoff 96. That's only 5 points less than what they gave Sensible Soccer, a rather silly 78%. And yet some of the problems they mention do exist in this first version. The goalies are quite phenomenally stupid. They will do things utterly beyond reason, going way off their line to try to deal with simple shots and screwing them up in the process. They barely save anything. Now, having terrible goalies isn't a major fault. It can certainly mean tons of fun in multiplayer matches as endless goals fly in, but it is an issue. Another minor issue is a bug that means there isn't any cards. This can be a bit more irritating, seeing as it means you can basically foul without taking any big risks unless you're in and around the penalty box. So the game wasn't quite perfect yet. In the rush to get it out for the deadline, the game shipped with a couple of faults. Shock, shock, horror! But this is Sensible Software we're talking about here, and the faults weren't just going to go unfixed. A few months later, Sensible Soccer version 1.1, or Sensible Soccer European Champions, hit the shelves. The teams were fully updated for the 92-93 season, more crowd noise was added, the card bug was fixed, and importantly, the keepers were rejigged. Although thankfully they weren't taken too far the other way. goalkeepers hadn't suddenly become virtually impenetrable walls. They could still make errors, but they would be more human errors. Whenever the ball did go past them, it was understandable and not the clear result of a screw-up in the CPU's logic. It just missed the keeper's fingertips. It works the other way too, you know. Sometimes you hit a shot that's a real peach and looks in all the way, you've scored many like them before, and yet the keeper dives and just manages to tip it onto the post and out for a corner. There are no hotspots in this game at all. And what do I mean by hotspot? Well, if I take you all the way back to Tehkan World Cup, you may have noticed that all the goals I scored looked exactly like this. That's a hotspot, a place where you're assured of scoring a goal. Sensi doesn't have these. It has some areas where you've got more chance of scoring, but nowhere where it's a certainty. With the release of European Champions, virtually all irregularities present in the original game were fixed, with none of the first version's playability squandered. There were only improvements, and it appeared as though Sensi had the perfect game. Another bunch of high review scores followed, and it should be noted for posterity that the previously harsh Amiga action fell right in line with everyone else, awarding 90% to European champions. There was one more release of the original game on the Amiga, version 1.2 or the International Edition, available for £20 in full or again a few quid for an upgrade, and released in the summer of '94. The game basically being a quick goodbye to the original Sensi, with the sequel set to come out fairly soon. There were only a couple of real changes made for this edition, the main one being the addition of teams outside Europe. Finally, Brazil could enter the fray. And, like every other team, all the player names were absolutely real, and every player was given the Sensi look. Sure, that may have only meant that they'd have either ginger hair or dark hair and be black or white, but once again, little details that games hadn't had before, and the fact that the players also had similar attributes to the real-life ones also helped somewhat. The real names were a nice Amiga bonus. The game wasn't exactly fully licensed, but, well, it was a different time. International Edition was also updated to include all players for the 93-94 season, and it included every team from the 94 World Cup competition, which was then conveniently stuck into a World Championship preset competition. On the pitch, the only major change is that the cards above a shamed dirty player's head have gone and have been replaced by an actual referee. Aside from that, the gameplay has received little in the way of tweaks, but then there wasn't really a great deal to tweak after European Champions. This was the last major release for the original game, and it was a nice little addition to the collection. But still, there's more. Hell, we'll be going back to the Amiga to look at a couple of silly little games Sensi created with their soccer engine. But what about the ports? Sensible Soccer was a popular game after all. What, you thought they just wouldn't bother taking it out of the Amiga comfort zone? No chance. Sensible Soccer travelled all over the console world making a name for itself. It appeared on just about every major console going. So let's briefly run through a bunch of console ports. You know you want to. So the Master System version is first up to the plate. And to be frank, it's a long way off all the others. This version gets everything wrong. The aftertouch is barely there, the play is way too fast and really jerky as well, with tons of slowdown. It has no flow, the player switching is terrible. It feels nothing like the original. This is easily the worst version of Sensible Soccer, nothing else is even close. The exact same game also came out for the Game Gear, with no changes made, and it's just as terrible in portable form. I call this one the fat version of Sensible Soccer. This SNES version is, well, it's okay, but it's got some problems. The game feels certainly closer to the original than the Master System version, that's for sure, but it's still not really there. Too many stupid things happen. Sometimes the goalie rushes out for no reason at all. And the look of the game is also terrible. As I alluded to, everything is stretched out, and sometimes the text or images don't even fit on the screen. And that's just sloppy. I don't really like the cherries that this game features, the unnecessary in-game music, a goal display. These things just aren't needed. I also don't like the addition of difficulty levels, and I really don't like the addition of extra buttons, although thankfully the B button gives you the usual control over the ball you'd expect without having to use buttons for automatic passes and long kicks. Sensei on the SNES is pretty decidedly average, far from the best version of the game, and that's not just my bias talking, because guess what? The Sega 16-bit version is up next. Firstly, I am happy to see that everything's back in proportion. The game looks just as it should, and virtually indistinguishable from the Amiga version. Again, one button does all that you need the ball to do, although there is an automatic long ball button. Still, those cherries remain, since he doesn't need in-game music, especially when it's as shite as this. The atmosphere is also lacking in this one. What's up with the crowd noise? It sounds like a loop gone one, a very short loop for that matter, juddering all over the place. A bit of a negative. Another problem that this version has, and one that the SNES version shares, is that the ball control is lacking. It's like the game's gone back to the Micro Soccer days, where the ball was just glued to your feet. To be honest, this is a bit of a major flaw. But it's a good version on the whole, and the improvements in computer AI and better graphics put it above the SNES version for me. Just make sure you play the PAL version of the game. The NTSC version is way too fast. You can also get this version on the Mega CD, complete with FMV and a rather dead sounding crowd. Now this version came as a bit of a surprise, because frankly I'd not heard anything good about it at all. But really, it's not bad. For a handheld version of Sensei on a pretty underpowered machine, it's solid as a rock. The lack of power means you don't get any silly extras, you just get sensible soccer as it should be. And unlike the 16-bits, this game actually has Sensei's ball control. A bit of skill is required to do some dribbling. It's not as fast as the Amiga version, and the camera is closer in than it should be, but I would expect both of these things from a Game Boy. And the lack of speed means that the camera isn't an issue, and vice versa. The only real problem with this game is that the aftertouch is utterly insane, although that still makes for some rather amusing sights or crazy goals. If you want sensible soccer on a handheld, this is easily the best version you're gonna get. You won't care for it much if you're a racist, but for everyone else it's jolly good fun. So, what console has the best conversion of sensible soccer? It's not a Sega machine. It's not a Nintendo machine. Well, prepare yourself for a shock. The best conversion of Sensei is on the... Yep, the machine that invited you to do the math, Atari's last colossal failure, one of the worst gaming libraries in history, a badly made piece of shit machine. The Atari Jaguar is one and all of these things, but it still plays a mean game of sensible soccer. Now I may have been hampered by having to control it with a keyboard, but it's a very easy winner. The game controls and feels very close to the Amiga. Not fully there, but the speed is much more accurate than the 16-bit versions, and it's got proper ball control to boot. We still have needless extra buttons, but as long as the Sensei button is there, then there isn't really an issue. The game looks very nice too. They could have ruined it by adding even more extras than the Mega Drive and SNES versions had, but instead the Jaguar team gives the game a shiny new coat of paint while still keeping faith to the original. The game looks lovely as a result, perhaps the best looking version of the game ever. Those extra 48 bits were good for something after all. It's obviously not going to beat the Amiga mothership, but it certainly jinks past all the other console conversions and boots the ball into the back of the onion with ease. For once, the Jaguar is top of the tree. Something to keep in mind if you're unfortunate enough to own one of these machines and you're desperately looking for something decent to play on it that isn't Tempest 2000. Phew, well this has been another long video. And there's still a couple of silly little games that were released on Amiga magazine cover discs to cover, but they'll give the video a nice little finish. First off, we have Unsensible Soccer, which appeared on a March '93 Amiga Action cover disc. Why unsensible? Because it gives you a chance, finally, to compare apples and oranges and see which of them would win in a fair game of football. Next up, we have the excellent Sensible Soccer 92-93 meets Bulldog Blighty, which came out in January 93 for Amiga Power. The game features 3 different instances of England facing Germany, with the team that scores the first goal winning. The 93 game is a no-frills Sensi match. The 66 game is also a no-frills Sensi match, but in black and white. The craziness, however, comes with the 1944 match, which features 2 teams of soldiers kicking a live grenade about, a grenade that will, indeed, explode every so often. This is frankly brilliant. They even went to the trouble of programming an actual grenade's bounce. And don't those soldiers look somewhat familiar? Well, they link me neatly onto the final extra, Canon Soccer, made for a Christmas edition of Amiga format. The game contains a special level from one of Sensi's other releases, the almighty Cannon Fodder, that takes place on a football pitch and has you mow down machine gun toting footballers while the chopper chases you. And as another neat touch, this level features huts taken from the game Sensi made before Sensi Soccer, Megalomania. And with that, I think we've pretty much come full circle on Sensible Soccer, and finally, we can end this video. So, in part 3, we'll see what Sensible Software did next. Many other developers out there reacted to Sensi with football games of their own that were, shall we say, highly influenced by Sensi, but the big question was how John Hare and company, having created the greatest football game ever made, could possibly follow it up. In the next video, we'll see how they did. We're moving to December 94 and the release of Sensible World of Soccer. You can move with me too. Join me!
You're a gold starring superstar hero. You let your head down and play to the band. You're a gold starring superstar hero. And every goal, that you're the best in the land.
My mind is racing at this point. Visions of tiny little footballers running through my mind's eye 24 hours a day, curling shots around my brainstem. I look at the ground I've already covered and just how much more there is to go, and I feel like I've bitten off way more than I can chew. I don't want to know just how much Sensible Soccer I've played. All I know is that it's enough to start wearing thin, and that's before you add on all the other football games from the time I've looked at. In short, I'm dangerously close to hitting the wall. It's that man versus food thing, where even the best cooked meals eventually start to taste like mashed up paper if you eat way too much of them. But I kind of wonder how often John Hare, Chris Chapman and the rest of the Sensi team felt like they were bottoming out through the development of this game, the sequel to the best-selling Amiga game of them all, Sensible Soccer. How do you follow up on a game that most people consider unimprovable by God or man? Sensi was untouchable. Through the 3 versions of the original game, they'd seemingly perfected the formula to the point where nothing else could possibly be done. And it had influenced many other games as well. In the wake of the game, so many football games came out, all of which were inspired by Sensi. I mean, I won't bore you with details, as you can just refer to my video on one of the more intriguing Sensi rip-offs, Football Glory, a game made by the same folks who'd go on to do Serious Sam. It wasn't really apparent as to where on earth Sensible Software could go. And then someone got a fiendish, dangerous idea. I like to think that John Hare was sat in his study, idly spinning a tiny little globe around, when the idea suddenly clicked. What if we create something that isn't just a plain football game, but a veritable encyclopedia of world football? You can forget about Europe and a bunch of South American national teams. What about club teams from New Zealand, El Salvador, Taiwan? Let's make room for the little guys like the Solomon Islands, Vietnam, Fiji, Southampton. And we won't just be paying lip service to these places. The players will be real and their stats will be accurate. All of them. We will include everyone. And then, to top it all off, we give the player control over this whole world, to live in it and to do whatever they see fit. It will be, ladies and gentlemen, a sensible world of soccer. That was the idea. It may well seem completely crazy, likely because it was. Perhaps the team didn't quite realise just what they'd let themselves in for, suddenly shrinking when they realised just what they were doing. Let me make a comparison for you. The original Sensi had about 100 to 150 teams with a handful of preset leagues and cups. Modern day football games have a few more. FIFA 12 has 29 leagues and 42 national teams, making for about 300 teams overall. Not bad, eh? Well, Sensible World of Soccer, or SWOS as fans call it, has 1,500 teams. Over 20,000 players, all of them will. Oh, and a few custom teams as well. When they said that SWOS was going to be the most in-depth football game ever, yeah, they meant it. In fact, their words were backed with nuclear weapons. Needless to say, the development of SWOS took time. Originally slated for release in late '93, it was delayed for a full year, finally coming out in time for Christmas in '94. And even then, the release was once again less than perfect. Many people complained about a whole variety of bugs, players dropping in value no matter how well they played in career mode, or being able to continue managing a club even if you'd been sacked. There were also a fair few complaints about the difficulty, but we'll get to them later on. Once again, a version 1.1 was required and was released a couple of months later. This time, buyers of the original got the disc for free after Sensi admitted that they'd rushed the game out for Christmas and hadn't been able to get it perfect. Perhaps understandable, as chances are Christmas '94 was likely going to be the last festive season in which the Amiga would be a serious feature. The bugs didn't stop a rush of incredible review scores, however. Every mag going gave it 90 or above, with Amiga Power, CU Amiga and Amiga Format scoring it at or over 95. And despite the shoddy launch, in the end those marks were deserved. And not only just because the game was such an achievement in terms of scope. Even though Sensi Software plainly had tons of work to do on researching all these teams, not to mention adding huge new aspects to this game like a career mode and tactics editing, both of which we'll get to eventually, they still managed to keep the Sensi standard. Of course, the gameplay was already great enough, but some things have changed. And yeah, the game did get a lot harder, especially as there's now a much wider gap between the great and, well, the not so great. Take an example match between the almighty Azzurri of Italy and the minuscule nearby republic of San Marino. In original Sensi there is a definite skill gap between these teams, but it's not so huge that you wouldn't stand a chance. I lost this particular match 4-2, a respectable defeat against a giant that would be a cause for celebration amongst the republic's 30,000 citizens. Original Sensi does mark San Marino's stats up a bit from reality. If you're good at the game, you could perhaps even win matches with San Marino. SWOS, however, is closer to true life. San Marino, well, they play like San Marino, a team that's won one match in their entire history. So yeah, a game against Italy will be somewhat one-sided, unless you're some kind of Sensi god, which I am not. This applies to players in teams as well. Rather than having a couple of star players in a team, everyone has their own specific level. Once you get intimate with a team, you'll be able to see the big differences between players, how one controls better than the other, someone else has a lot more power, another one just fits more, and so on. It's all in the details, and it's all easily digestible without having to look at a massive freaking spreadsheet. And of course, that's why optimising your team is important. Which brings us neatly onto the Tactics Editor, one of the big additions to SWOS. The Tactics Editor is simple stuff really. You pick a set formation to work on, and then you move players and a ball around a grid. You pick a position for the ball, and wherever you move the player to is where the player will try to be in an actual match when they don't have the ball. Easy as that. You can do whatever you want. If I want my players to try and form a phalanx in their half whenever they don't have the ball, I can do it. But better than that, you can put every player in the positions where they'll be most effective. Find places they like. A good set of tactics can drastically increase the effectiveness of your team. It really does make a huge difference. And it means there's lots of opportunity for obsessive tinkering. With hundreds, nay thousands of different combinations to look at, you could be here for quite some time. It takes a minute to pick up, but a whole lifetime to master. But you don't actually have to do it. A team will not automatically play like 20 stone chuggers if you don't use the editor. You can have just as much fun and be good with a team just with the preset formations. It's a very broad church. And then there's the other big addition, and really the addition that makes me absolutely love the game to bits, the big difference between Vanilla Sensi and SWOS. The career mode is where the world truly comes into focus. 20 years of being a manager, playing matches every so often, but mostly buying and selling players and, of course, seeing to those damn tactics, tinkering with positions and simming to see just what sticks to the wall. Once again, the footy manny side of Sensi isn't difficult to pick up. It's not as in-depth as the big management sims of the time, like Premier Manager 3 or Ultimate Soccer Manager, but it provides a great mix between managing a team and playing. It gives you a great feeling of being a coach, without all the extraneous waffle. The best thing about career mode though, is that it gives you a chance to tell your own big, epic, sensible soccer story over 20 seasons. I'll give you an example. I usually start out with a big team like AC Milan, knowing that I'll probably screw the pooch royally, because managing a team like them is actually really hard. AC Milan are perhaps the best club team in the game, which is great, but it also means that the wage bill's through the roof and you'll go in debt sharpish if you don't sell half of these star players immediately. That and, well, results just don't usually go my way. What can I say? I'm no expert. I am naught but a cack-handed peasant, in way over his head. If that dunderhead Smithy was ever actually given a proper football job, this would be how it would go. The team isn't gelling, players are dropping in value left and right, the club is deep in the wed, and everything is going wrong. Needless to say, the chairman is not best pleased with my performance. Anyway, after nearly leading one of the giants of Europe to relegation and the joys of Serie B, I'm booted out the door and swiftly moved on to a parade of middling Italian league clubs, all of which I inevitably screw up because now I don't even have any decent players to compete with the likes of Juve or Inter. That and I lost the dream job, so now the motivation's just not there. Eventually no other Italian club wants to touch me with a barge pole. I'm blacklisted, a manager without a country. Sometimes the game does actually end here, at rock bottom. No one offers you another job and that's it. Back to stacking shelves in Sudbury for you, Jack. But other times a minor club will reach out to you and pull you in from the cold. They may be total minnows, but they want you, even if nobody else does. My favourite was always Norma Tallinn, one of the big teams in Estonia. Yes, Estonia. Now obviously I take the job because there's nothing else going, and suddenly things start going my way. I can win the title and cup in Estonia with ease, meaning Champions League football, which also means, of course, money. Money to build up the team, buy some 7-figure players. A few seasons later, I've turned lowly Norma Tallinn into one of the strongest teams in Europe. I actually won the Champions League with them once. And then I got offered the England job, and what do you know? I ended up winning the World Cup and retiring with my head held high. A true story. A sensible story. 'Twas a good 20 seasons, I can tell you. I've never really had that sort of narrative in any other footy manny game, although that does tend to be because I quickly get worn down by the endless number crunching and complexities. I just can't do Football Manager, I'm too impatient. SWOS is perfect for me. Footy management on steroids and with a story. I still feel like I've only scratched the surface with SWOS on the Amiga. There is so much more to talk about. But if we mentioned everything, well, we could be here for hours, so perhaps it's time to draw a bit of a line in the sand. The game received a couple more versions, although they mostly only added cherries, updated teams and made minor improvements, like adding training matches for example. 9697, the version I had, is the last and best one, and most would agree on that. While SWOS wasn't ported to any console at the time, it did arrive on the other computer system. The PC version of SWOS is just fine as well, although it does feel a little different. The play just isn't quite the same, and the view, it's a bit zoomed in. So I prefer the look and play of the Amiga version. However, it's perfectly good for just playing the game, especially these days. In short, SWOS is the greatest football game ever. Not much else to say aside from that. It may be over 15 years old, but I've looked at so many other football games since then, trying to find in them the same sort of feeling, the glorious playability and crazy depth that I got from SWOS, and I've never been able to find it. SWOS is a beautiful mixture of things that just shouldn't exist together. A crazy project that you'd have to be more than eccentric to think of, and utterly insane to carry out. And yet it works so good. And let's not forget, one of the 10 most important games ever. Say no more. Say no more. But still, we're not done with the series yet. SWOS wasn't where the story ended. It's all well saying that SWOS may be 15 years old, but it can still boot the arses of every other football game released since. But who else is playing the game today aside from crazy people who are just living in the past? And how did John Hare and company cope with the switch from 2D to 3D? Could Sensible Soccer survive that? In the fourth and final video, we'll find out the answers to these questions. We have 2 more full Sensi games to look at, and we'll also have a look at how a dedicated group of people are still, to this day, keeping SWOS truly relevant.
My name's Carly, and suckface Amanda. Well, she sucked a bogran, because guess what? So gave back our assignments. Oh, so excellent, because guess what? I beat her. Beat her because she spat blood badly. Because guess what? Mine just looks so good because of my Commodore Amiga. So easy. I might do homework more often just to get Amanda. She's so furious and such a spat because she hasn't got one. Suffer chronically, Amanda. See ya.
You're a gold starring superstar hero. You let your head down and play to the fans. You're a gold starring superstar hero. And every goal, says you're the best in the land.
So, this is the last video. The journey's just about done. I can rub my eyes and clear those tiny footballers from my brain. Now what I'd really like is to end on a big high note, but oh, that's going to be a tough ask. There are reasons why Sensible Software just isn't a big name anymore. Most of the games I'm covering in this video sadly are either not very good or fatally flawed in some way. So, what happened? It's pretty fair to say that Sensible Software rank high amongst the great developers. Leaving the Sensi games aside, they made Cannon Fodder 1 and 2, Whizball, Megalomania, Microprose Soccer, and WizKid. Unique games that were chock full of personality. There's no other developer that could have pulled off presenting Cannon Fodder the way they did, mixing buckets of blood with British irreverence and powerful allegory with jet black comedy. 1995 saw their first real misstep. Sensible Golf was an attempt to take the Sensi aesthetic into another sport, but it felt a bit rudderless. A vanity project, the exact video game equivalent of Madcap Ginger Chris Evans' Tea Time TV series. The game wasn't pilloried, but the 70s it largely received were low for a dev team that had delivered almost nothing but 90s up to that point. And aside from SWOS updates, it was also the team's last commercial Amiga release, releasing a tiny little goodbye game called Sensible Trainspotting on an Amiga Power cover disc before getting on the lifeboat. No one really had a go at their team for moving on from the Amiga. The system was dead by now, and Sensible Software had to move on to bigger and greater things. They could have moved on years ago and no one would have minded too much. They deserved it. And besides, they had had another insane, dangerous idea. I should say immediately that you can get the absolute definitive word on perhaps the greatest game that never was, Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, directly from the horse's mouth at Eurogamer. You should absolutely read John Hare's article that I've so thoughtfully linked to in the box. In fact, why don't you just stop the video and do that now? Now! Read it? Good. Now, it would be pointless for me to retell the story of how the game eventually fell down the tubes, but I can talk about my own feelings on the game, including what I remember from its appearances in various mags of the time. When pictures came out of the game in '96, it really looked like something else. Multimedia might have been a bit of a dirty word in gaming at that point, but this most certainly wasn't that. It felt different. A mix of great funny looking videos with point and click written gameplay. That and the team behind it obviously gave us plenty of hope because they'd never failed us yet. Looking back at the videos now, its vaporware fate is such a shame. The game's look is still striking, with characters shaped a lot like people from Viz given a new dimension, and the mix of that and the cardboard cutout everyday people is an inspired touch, one that would still play very well now, I think. The music videos that Sensi Software created are frankly brilliant, more than just age-old artifacts. And then you top all that off with a big concept soundtrack from Hare and Joseph. It's being an early 3D game doesn't mean diddly squat. We still celebrate games like Blade Runner and Grim Fandango, and surely this game would have fit right in amongst them. If it had ever had the chance to come out, it could have really been something. Alas, it simply wasn't to be, and it ended up being their Heaven's Gate in a way. Perhaps if Sensi Software had waited a couple more years, and if they'd had a bit more luck in development, Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll would have been received much more enthusiastically by the publishers that eventually pulled it. It had all the makings of a great game. So, where to now? Well, the obvious answer would be another football game, developed alongside the stricken SDR. Sensible Soccer would make its return in 1998, and it would be in 3D. However, things had changed while the kin had been away. Sensi was very late coming into the 3D football scene, meaning that for the first time they'd be following the pack instead of leading it. The promise of games like Actua Soccer in the 90s had led to actual strong titles coming a couple of years later, and by 1998 the football pie was already in the process of being divided up between two big nations. EA's FIFA series, having struggled to find a footing with its first few 3D games, had done so. Road to World Cup 98 was a stunning sim, packed with all the players and teams you could want, a big stadium feel, lots of commentary, and of course very decent football. But a new face had also emerged: Konami. International Superstar Soccer started life on 16-bit consoles and was widely acclaimed there. ISS Deluxe is perhaps the best non-Sensi footy game of the 16-bit era. And with their first 3D release, ISS Pro, they hit the ground running. This was a great arcadey football sim, much like Sega's solid Virtua Striker games. And even though they lacked the real players of the FIFA franchise, people loved the fast, furious pick-up-and-play nature of the game, even if the commentary was, frankly, ridiculous.
He's over, but the referee should have called that. What a prime example of poor official. Good job those players covered up well. That boy's got a steel scarf. It's yellow. That's an early buff.
Swat! That was liquid football!
So both simulation and arcade angles were pretty well covered, and already other attempts to make football games were faltering. They just didn't have the muscle of the big two, and they were usually inferior anyway. However, could the return of a big name like Sensible Soccer turn the tides? Unfortunately, it couldn't. I may as well come clean. Sensible Soccer 98 is not a good game. For a 3D football game, it was frankly past it by 98. Sales were poor and reviews were largely negative. If it wasn't for the name, nobody would have paid it any attention, but the fact that it had the Sensi name on it meant that really it hurt all the more. The game does just about have the same camera angle as classic Sensi, but that's basically it. Sensi's great success in and loyalty towards the 16-bit platforms meant that they stuck around there for a lot longer than most other big developers, which was great in one way, but in another way it really hurt them. They just didn't have the experience in 3D programming to make the Sensi engine shine in the new dimension, experience that they could have perhaps gained by leaving the 16 bits behind a little earlier. The fluid passing and switching isn't there, the AI is a confusing mixture of slow-witted and razor-sharp, almost switching between them every minute. The crowd is weaker. Everything is weaker, from the aftertouch to the slide tackles, the team selection to the customization and the tournament options. It doesn't feel like Sensi, it feels like a hacked out third-rate title. The ugliness of the game doesn't help as well. You know, it's a typical retro reviewer cliche to say that early 3D games don't hold up well visually, but let's not mince words. This game didn't look good then, let alone now. I really hate to bag on a sensible soccer game like this, but alas, there's just nothing good to say about it. If this game had been made by anyone else and if it had a completely different name, this review would be so much more saltier and biting. But with Sensi 98, I can only shake my head and offer a bit of sympathy. The sad truth is that Sensible Soccer 98, in all of its versions, says a lot about the state of affairs at Sensi Software at the time. Sensi 98 was a secondary title, of course. SDR was the main focus. And when SDR died, Sensi Software had to lay off most of their staff. Being a fairly small team in the first place, they didn't have a structure that could support the big manpower needed for multiple state-of-the-art 3D titles. That was a factor in the ultimate demise of SDR and the failure of this game. When Sensi 98 was released, the company was already winding down, filling out a contractual obligation to GT Interactive. The dream was already over. In any case, after the contract with GT was terminated the following year, Sensible Software and all its assets and series were sold to Codemasters, and the Sensible Soccer name faded into history. The end. Until 2006, when Codemasters decided to actually do something with a sensible IP that wasn't a handheld or mobile port. And that particular something would be the relaunch of Sensible Soccer, with John Hare overseeing the project and the coding handled by Kuju Sheffield, a young promising dev team. Of course, everyone was aware that getting Sensi over now would be even tougher than it was in '98. The football game market was an almost total duopoly. FIFA and Pro Evolution Soccer, the new name for ISS, controlled everything. Having beaten everybody else into total submission, all they had left was each other. But the hope was that there would still be a buzz out there for a new Sensi, and a low price point would seal the deal, the game only costing £20 new. That, and it would come out right in time for the big footy event of the year, the World Cup in Germany. And they made that date, releasing the game on June the 9th, the day of the first match of the tournament between Germany and Costa Rica. Everyone really hoped that this time, John Hare and Kuju had managed to get it right. And in the end, they had. Mostly. Sensible Soccer 2006 is much, much better than 98. For starters, just look at the game. This is 3D Sensi done properly. It's absolutely lovely looking. The new player sprites have perhaps even more charm than the legendary tiny footballers from games past, and the little scenes that play out following goals and cards never get old. The game has the original Sensi speed down pat, and the movement is as fluid as it can be, and the additions to the controls like a sprint button and the tiniest implementation of a power bar actually happen to work pretty well for the game. Play this in multiplayer and you'll have an absolutely fantastic time, just as you would have with the Sensi games of old. However, there are a lot of buts. Big buts. I cannot lie. I still don't find the passing and the general control to be as strong as it once was. It's just not as natural feeling as Sensi. And the sound also doesn't really match the excellence of the graphics. Sensi's context-sensitive crowd, something that so many other football games had tried to ape ever since its appearance in the original, is lacking here. Two things really kneecap the game above everything else though. Firstly, the lack of customization and questionable team selection. Unlike Sensi games of old, the game doesn't like you setting anything up yourself at all. You can only create a single custom team, which is disappointing considering how you could basically do anything you wanted with Sensi teams in the past. The game doesn't even let you save any options. If you want to set a different formation for your team, you'll have to do it every single time you play a match, which quickly gets tiresome. Frankly, the single player story mode just isn't an option. And the team selection, while fairly detailed, is odd. One wonders what they were thinking when they made a game to sell to British people and they didn't include Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. Now the Republic might scoff momentarily, until they realise that they aren't in it either. So having insulted a pretty sizable chunk of the people who could be buying this game, they then increased the problems tenfold by letting a load of bugs get through. The game's AI is really simplistic. Every team plays the same and it all comes down to the goalkeepers, who sometimes behave really oddly. They'll either teleport across the box to make a miracle save, or they'll let simple balls slip through their fingers and into the net. The game does tend to crash quite a bit too, always making you feel like it's on its last legs whenever it pauses momentarily, or the sound starts playing up, or the game slows down. The PS2 version of the game that I'm using is slightly better for this than the Xbox version, which apparently crashes a lot, but it's still an issue here. For me, the fault for all of this doesn't really lie with Kuju, the developers. It lies with Codemasters. What we have in Sensi 2006 is a game that clearly needed just a couple more months in development to shore everything up, dot the I's and cross the T's. If the game had had that, it would have been superb. As it is, it's a very flawed gem. I question Codemasters' decision not only to wash the game out unfinished, which is an obvious cardinal sin, but to even launch it for the World Cup at all. By positioning it for release then, they fully associated the game with the World Cup, meaning people would be interested in it while the World Cup was on. After the Cup it would disappear. Basically they took the short-term smash and grab option and it failed. The shoddy state of the game meant that reviews were ultimately quite mixed, the highest score it got easily being a 9 out of 10 from Eurogamer that was frankly questionable. My general opinion is that Codies should have took their balls in their hands and gone for a launch at the start of the new season, go right into FIFA and Pro Evo's front yard. The game would have had more time to blossom in development, it would have had a bit more staying power, and it could have truly been presented as a cheap, fast-paced and much more fun alternative to the two hulking behemoths. Even if Pro Evo was largely considered invulnerable in 2006, FIFA certainly wasn't. Sensi 2006 could well have gained a foothold. But it wasn't to be. By the time the new season rolled around, most people had forgotten about the new Sensi, and there weren't any plans made for a 2007 version of the game. Once again, Sensi faded away. However, there would be one more release in 2007 under the Kuju banner. This was a bit of a no-brainer really. We released the almighty SWOS on Xbox Live Arcade. Now before we get going, I would like to apologise for the quality of the footage. Unfortunately I don't have any means of 360 capture, so this is what has to be done. Lord forgive me for what I'm about to do. Anyway, SWOS on XBLA. With a new coat of paint, all the options and teams of the original, and above everything else, online play! The new look is quite nice if you ignore all the big advertising surrounding the pitch, and there's an option to zoom the camera in and out. Well-meaning if ultimately rather useless, but hey-ho. The game generally feels like Sensi, not totally there, but a good conversion. But once again, a couple of things spoil the pot. First one being that this is a direct conversion of 96-97 with all the players from that game. People new to the game would be confronted with teams of players with bowdlerised names that had mostly retired. It would have certainly been tough work, but someone really should have set about updating the players. The out-of-date teams reduce the appeal for anyone who isn't familiar with the game's legacy. Secondly, the online was very poor. I tried to play it several times when it came out and it was a juddering, laggy mess that was never fixed, completely unplayable. And the reason it was never fixed is because the game barely sold. Another failure for the Sensi franchise. The newer gamer just wasn't interested in an old footy game with old players and crappy online, and really, why the hell would they be? And people in the know weren't that interested either. The new graphics didn't go down all that well amongst the faithful, and any tiny faults the conversion had were pounced on. That, and there already existed a very promising alternative way of playing new, updated, sensible World of Soccer. And finally, this is where the general mood of the video starts taking an upswing. The SWOS Total Pack is a fan-made launcher for the original game made by sensiblesoccer.de forum user Starwins, originally released in 2007. The purpose of the pack was to offer an easy way for everyone to play original SWOS on the PC without screwing around with the settings in DOSBox. This is all ready to go. But since then it's blossomed into something special. It now includes support for the Amiga version of SWOS through WinUAE, and a version of WinUAE that just happens to include Kailera, meaning that yes, you can play Sensible Soccer online, properly. The SWOS scene, based around sensiblesoccer.de and fellow Euro forum Sensibilita, home of the staggering online career, sadly only available in Italian but something that lets you share the Sensi life experience with a whole community, is still very much alive and well. Players that have honed their skills over the years and newer guys who just happen to have caught the Sensi bug joining together for leagues, tournaments, careers, or just your regular kickabout. Another thing about the SWOS Total Pack is that with it, it's very easy to add in fan-made updates for the original game. People have supplied new commentary, better pictures and surroundings, more crowd sounds, and yes, updated teams. With the SWOS Total Pack, you can play a game of SWOS with updated teams from the 2011-12 season, with an update for the new season expected in the coming months. And no, it's not just a half-assed job either. Every league has been updated with new players who have new stats. The editor that's included in the Total Pack makes it easy for folks to do, just as long as they've got the will to do it, and fortunately for all of us, they have. Sensible Soccer may well be done officially, but these are the guys who are keeping the game alive, making it relevant to today's footy scene and providing a proper alternative to the big games. If there ever existed a time when Sensible Soccer wasn't easy to pick up and play, it would die. But thanks to these guys, that's not going to happen. So that brings us right up to the present day. We've travelled from 1985 and the influences that shaped the game, through the glory days of the early 90s, and finally to the big now, with the game still in good health. Which means that finally, this video series can end. Well, I hope you've enjoyed watching the series as much as I've enjoyed making it, and a big sensible award to you if you've just motored your way through all 4 parts. Well done you. I would like to briefly give thanks to various places. sensiblesoccer.de and Sensibilita for keeping everything going, the Hall of Light and Amiga magazine rack for providing much needed info and magazine scans without which these reviews simply wouldn't be possible, and above all else, I would like to thank the old Sensible team for making such a brilliant series. Jops, Jules, Stu, CJ, RJ, Ubik, the whole damn lot of them. So, that's it. The full-time whistle. All that's left, as ever, is to say wherever you are and whoever you may be, have a good one, and take care.